welcome again, everyone. This is Thoughtworks Technology Reader Sneak Peek webinar. So it's a lot of words. Let me take a little bit time to break it down. So we are Thoughtworks, a tech consultant company. We try to solve, we help our client to solve their business problems through technology. And the Tech Reader is a document that we publish twice a year. I will talk more about it later. And the sneak peek webinar is a webinar where we give people, our reader fans, a sneak peek of the content of the upcoming webinar. First, let me introduce a bit more about the panelists today. So today we have Shangqi and Sudarshan joining us. Yeah, a bit about myself. My name is Ni Wang. I'm a lead consultant from Thoughtworks China. I'm the moderator today. And we have Shangqi and Sudarshan joining us today. Shangqi, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Shangqi Liu. You can call me Shangqi. I'm the head of blockchain in South China. Most people may know this know me by this role, and also I'm the head of South Hong Kong and Macau market, currently based in Shenzhen.
Thanks, Shangqi. Sudarshan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sudarshan. I'm from Bangalore, India, and I'm part of the doctor group along with Shangqi, representing India, and we are the group which puts the radar together.
Thanks, Sudarshan. Yeah, so I know Sudarshan and Shangqi from the Doppler group as well. So they are really great technologists that have very insightful knowledge around the technology world. So it's great to have both of them here today to share with us what's new in the upcoming Tech Radar. So before we start, let me give everyone a little bit introduction about the radar in case you are new to it. So as I said before, it's a document that we publish twice a year. It's more forward-looking, and it is based on our real and hands-on experience. And we organize those items, we call them blips, into a reader kind of a graphic, right? So there are 4 quadrants, covers 4 kind of areas, techniques, platforms, tools, and language and frameworks. And we also put them into 4 rings. So in the center is an adopter ring. It's the technologies we put there is that we have tried it many times, and we strongly recommend the industry to adopt those technologies when given the right context. And the blips in the trial ring is where that we have tried to put those technologies into production and found it useful. And we encourage you to try it as well, but it may not be as sophisticated as the items in the adopt ring. And SS is where the new stuffs and interesting, whether they are solving a new problem or solving an old problem with a new solution. So quite interesting to look into. And hold is something that we found it might be misused, or the concept has some flaws that we found it's not working. So please proceed with caution. And for each of the items, they have different shapes and they represent different stuffs. So just a little bit introduction about the radar. And just before we get into the real content, let me give you a little bit of logistics here. So you see in the Zoom, there is a Q&A function. Please use that Q&A function to ask questions, and feel free to ask questions along the way, because we are going to cover a lot of different blips or let's say the technology items. And if you are interested in any of those and have any questions, feel free to ask through the Q&A. And then we will keep the chat room open for everyone to discuss or to share some content with each other. And we will try to answer the questions along the way, but if we cannot answer them because of time, we cannot answer all of them, but we will see if we have a bit of time, we will cover more questions towards the end. Cool. Now let's get started. I think the first blip is from Sudarshan, talking about the eBPF.
Thank you, Ni. So yeah, our first blip for today is eBPF. eBPF stands for Extended Berkeley Packet Filter. It's a kernel technology that allows custom user space programs to run inside the Linux kernel. These programs can run in response to events, and there are thousands of possible events to which eBPF programs can be attached to. They include Linux trace points, the entry or exit from any kernel function, or the arrival or exit of network packets, so on and so forth. These eBPF programs can run safely inside the kernel because they are verified before they are injected in. And they are also JIT compiled into the native instruction code, which means they are sort of safe as well as very performant. Before eBPF, if we wanted to inject some custom behavior into the kernel, you would basically have to wait for many years. You'd have to get it in the kernel. You have to wait for everyone to upgrade to the latest version of kernel, so on and so forth. But with eBPF, it allows us to inject behavior into the kernel from user space pretty fast. Now, why is this interesting? Like eBPF support has been available in Linux kernel, I think for almost 7-8 years now. It's not new. In fact, it has even been in the radar in the past in trial. I think around 2 years ago, we blipped it in trial. And we've had a range of blips since around tools and products using eBPF. Like for example, a few years ago, we blipped Catran, which is a Facebook software-defined load balancer, which uses eBPF. Another example is Cilium. It's a network layer implementation for Kubernetes, which also uses eBPF. I think we felt it's worth reblipping eBPF again this time because there continues to remain a lot of innovation related to eBPF. It's become the default method of choice for achieving a range of use cases related to networking, security, performance tracing, observability, so on and so forth. So we felt it's worth reblipping it this time. And in terms of what's sort of happening related to it, like Google, for example, is using Cilium to bring eBPF-based networking to its GKE offering. And Cilium itself are now building an entire service mesh around eBPF. Essentially, they call it the sidecar-less service mesh. Like unlike other service meshes, they don't have a sidecar. It's just based on eBPF itself. Of course, some use cases may not be addressable at the eBPF layer, with Cilium addressed by using a proxy, but in general, that's one more use case which is now coming in. Given the prominence of eBPF itself and the amount of interest, a bunch of companies like Facebook, Google, Isowell, and Microsoft have launched an eBPF Foundation as part of Linux Foundation. An interesting observation from us was that Microsoft is now trying to extend eBPF for Windows, hopefully allowing your eBPF programs to directly work on Linux as well as Windows. So yeah, basically continued innovation remains interesting, just gaining adoption. So that's eBPF.
Thank you, Sudarshan. Just I also saw a post before that Alibaba is also AliCloud is also using eBPF to improve the observability of these applications that they are supporting. So it's quite a interesting area. Thank you for that. So the next blip is the UPID. I think it's from Shangqi.
Yeah, actually, before the webinar started, Sudarshan and we talk about maybe we can choose some more exciting blip as starting point, and the eBPF is definitely, I think it's quite trendy in the Linux kernel community, and then expand to the broader industry like cloud, like service mesh, and people are quite passionate about it. And in the area of software development, I would say the CUPID is quite another trendy topic within software community. And I don't know how many of you know this term because this is invented this year by Danos, but I'm quite sure that you may, as a software developer, you may know the solid principles. We have been used the solid principles for years. It's quite a long time, and we use it to guide our software architecture design and to guide us how to write, how to design a better code style. But the solid principle was born in the era of object-oriented programming, and now we are into the era of cloud computing, container-based distributed transaction, distributed system, and it's kind of over time, and coupled with recently the Uncle Bob's controversial remarks, so people are unwilling to discuss or talk about the solid principle, and so we have the CUPID. I do think we as software developers need some catchy rules to remind us how to write better code. And CUPID is actually a mnemonic recently proposed or invented by Danos. This is actually a short for the C is short for composable, which means you should write your software play well with others. And the U means Unix philosophy. Do one thing, do it well. And the P means predictable, do what you expect. And the I means idiomatic, feel nature. And the D means domain-based. The software, the solution domain model should fit the problem domain in the language and the structure. So actually, I would say the CUPID is not a dogma. It's more like an interesting starting point to guide us how to write better software. So each letter is an attribute rather than a principle. So we could, if we are following the principle, we can say we are following such principle, and not following such principle. But for the CUPID, actually we can use it as a attribute list to verify if we can continuously improve our software code. And plus, I personally quite like its name. So just like its name, the programming should be fun, should be creative, and I think that's part of the reason why we choose to put it on radar this time.
Thank you, Shangqi. As a non-native English speaker, I actually don't know this. I didn't know it can be called CUPID and it's a word. Thank you for that. I personally really like the Unix philosophy, the U in there. It's really good. Thank you for that. And again, everyone, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A, ask question, and we will try to answer them. Cool. So the next one is from Sudarshan, talking about interesting tool called ConfText.
Thanks, Ni. Yes, ConfText. ConfText actually has been in the radar in the past. It was in Assess last year. ConfText is basically, it's a tool which allows you to write tests against structured configuration data. Nowadays, a lot of the important tools we use are so config driven, and it's so fundamental to how those tools work that increasingly there are so many things which can break because of the configuration. And one of the things we've been looking out for is how do we write tests against our configuration? How do we make sure that what comes out of our build pipeline is solid, right? And ConfText is a tool which helps in that. It helps us write tests for, let's say, Kubernetes manifest, Tecton pipeline definitions, Terraform code, serverless configs, basically almost any config file. We've used it quite a bit in our projects, and we decided to move it to trial this time. It supports a range of config file formats. I think it supports JSON, it supports Dockerfile, it supports YAML. One or two more interesting formats it supports, which I think Shangqi will talk about later. It supports Cyclone DX format. If you can write ConfText tests for your Terraform modules, for example, after you'll have to write it against the plant file though. You basically get the JSON output of your plant file, and then you can write tests against it. So how does ConfText work? You write your tests in the Rego language. The reason for Rego language is it internally uses OPA, that is Open Policy Agent, under the hood. And that uses Rego as the DSL for defining policies. It's a great open source option for policy as code, OPA, and it's used in quite a few places. So I think it was a good choice to use OPA under the hood for ConfText. So people are now familiar with Rego language. You can now define your policies or your tests for your configuration in Rego language. What's interesting about using Rego and policies like this is if your actual platform like Kubernetes, for example, also uses OPA and Rego language for its policies for asserting or validating the manifest using OPA Gatekeeper, you can imagine the same policies bundled up and running as part of your build pipeline using conftest. That's at least the ideal vision here. I think there are some gaps in terms of what aspects of Rego language Gatekeeper allows and stuff, but I think we think it's pretty interesting and something to keep an eye out for. So that's conftest.
Thanks, Sudarshan. Cool. And I think next blip is next few blips and things is around a very interesting area. The first one is the Salsa. Sudarshan.
Sudarshan, speaking on mode. Yeah. So yeah, Salsa. I guess the area is, this is a very hot area, right? We have seen a lot of attacks in the last few years targeting the supply chain or vulnerabilities in the supply chain. Example would be SolarWinds or CodeCough from last year, right? Like they are examples of supply chain vulnerabilities which were attacked. In general, it appears that attackers are shifting from the running application in production to attacking the supply chain. And acknowledging this, there have been a range of blips in our tech radar over the last few years in this space. And SLSA or Salsa is one more blip in the space. It stands for supply chain levels for software architects, or Salsa. It is a consortium curated guidance for organizations to protect against supply chain attacks. The consortium itself includes companies like Google, Linux Foundation, CNCF, etc. It's based off, it's essentially based off an internal version of Salsa, which Google itself uses. And it's been using it, I think, since 2013 or so, and requires it for all their production workloads. So what we particularly like about Salsa is it's not a very tool-centric approach. It's basically, it also provides a checklist of concrete threats and practices along with a maturity model. So what are the key aspects of Salsa? Probably the most important aspect is the Salsa levels. Essentially, it's a maturity model. It goes from level 1 to level 4. Salsa level 4 basically represents the ideal end state. And the lower levels, of course, represent milestones with corresponding integrity guarantees. It also has a threat model. It's a very easy to follow threat model with real world examples of attacks. They break up the supply chain into various trust boundaries, the source threats, the build threats, dependency threats, so on and so forth. And they give some nice real world examples of the various threats within those boundaries. An example of, for example, the source threats, an example would be, when last year, I think an attacker compromised PHP's self-hosted Git server and injected 2 malicious commits. This prompted PHP to move away from a self-hosted Git server to a hosted Git server. That's an example of the sort of threats for each of the trust boundaries and the threats. They have these examples. And of course, and Salsa also talk about what are the technical requirements for an artifact to meet the Salsa levels. Like, what does it take to be a Salsa level 2? If you're at level 1, an organization or your project can assess yourself and say, okay, I'm right now at level 1. What does it take for me to go to level 2? What are the sort of threats I need to protect against? What are the technical requirements? So on and so forth. We think it's a very useful framework, provides very applicable advice. I think we are sort of recommending that our projects also consider it. And we expect that more organizations will start learning from it.
So in addition to the Salsa, another blip that may related to the software supply chain is the Cyclone DX. We can go to the next page. The Cyclone DX is actually I would say it's a platform, it's a standard, it's an ecosystem, contains a lot of like tool chains and support variable programming languages to help to define the SBOM. For you who may not know SBOM, last time reader we believe this concept SBOM, which means software bill of material. The people may familiar with the concept that the bill of material, but also for the software. Actually, nowadays our software and the product grows more and more complex, and we need to treat the our dependency very carefully. And it is actually initiated by the White House to audit the software dependencies, but then it turns into more practical. So after last time we blipped the SBOM, people may wondering, do we have any tool or standard to follow to have such compliance or audit requirements? Then we saw that people invented Cyclone DX too, and it's quite useful. And Cyclone DX is actually a standard for describing the machine readable SBOM, and it is originally initiated from OWASP and improves on the previous standard called SPDX. The Cyclone DX can define the dependency not only for the local machine dependency, but also it could define the dependency from remoting services. It's more fits nowadays our distributed system nature. And also Cyclone DX has established an ecosystem that supports multiple languages. So what makes us so passionate about this is because it do have, it's not just the standard let us to follow, it do provide some tools. So through its CLI toolchain, we can actually integrate the Cyclone DX into our CI/CD pipeline to make sure we can analyze our SBOM changes through verifying the signature change of our software dependency. So this is a blip Cyclone DX, and combined with other tools together, we saw this quite useful for supply chain software supply chain dependency management. And maybe we can go to next page. So blips like Salsa, Cyclone DX point to a more broader field which navigate to our theme today, the software supply chain innovation. So in previous radar, we have a theme called protecting your software supply chain. That's because nowadays, as our software dependencies becomes more and more complex, very few people rely on just the standard library or framework from the programming language provided to build their software. Nowadays, most people are using various open source software libraries to build complex solutions. And actually, our program faces more and more attack phase. I believe many people are shocked by the Log4j vulnerability last year. And many people may not know that our vast modern digital platform is underpinned by such a small pillar like Log4j. So if our supply chain, each pillar of our software supply chain is very vulnerable, that means our whole software is very vulnerable to attack. And things actually got worse given nowadays we are facing more and more geopolitical conflict. So different regions, they may have the requirement, complex requirement to audit the software dependency from another region. And also we have another theme in this radar called the economic change of open source software. So even sometimes some software author just decide to abandon their software, abandon their library, and decide to declare their open source GitHub repository. So that may also lead into a very serious security issue to your software. So as software development team, we must realize that engineering practice need to include the software supply chain protection. We need to verify, we need to manage our software dependencies. So we are happy to see a lot of innovations happen in this area, such as the Salsa, such as the Cyclone DX, the SBOM, the SIFT we listed on this radar. So we hope to see this field continues to grow. And also we're calling the software community and the software industry to pay more attention to secure your software supply chain.
Yeah, I think I was reading a couple of data points. Basically, if you look at the supply chain attacks which have happened, let's say in 2019 and compare it to what's happening in 2021, I think there's a huge increase. And I think Gartner are predicting that I think the next 2-3 years, they expect that by 2024 or 5, half of all organizations will have at least one supply chain attack targeted at them. So it's definitely an increasing space of potential attacks, and therefore increasing innovation as well to respond.
Thank you, Sudarshan and Shangqi. It's always good to see more and more aspects of the software development area getting secured. And it's also a good area to see more and more things going in from there. Just before we move on, for anyone who is new to the radar, so along with the about 100 of blips that we publish within each of the volume of the radar, we also publish some of the things that we think, just to group some of the topics that the groups, when the group talk about those blips, they see many of the major trends or any of the topic that comes once again, and was to putting them together to be put as a bigger topic, and we call them things and put it into the radar as well. So in the sneak peek webinar, we will cover 2 of the things, but we will definitely have more in the radar. So this is the first thing for today. Thank you for Shangqi and Sudarshan to cover that. And also thank you for everyone who is discussing and sharing link in the chat. It's really great to see that. Cool. Let's move on to next one. I think Apache Iceberg is Sudarshan, right?
Yes, Apache Iceberg. So I guess a lot of us will have, some of us who have worked in the data space definitely will have heard of Hive. Hive is basically, if you want to do SQL on Hadoop stack, Hive is your default option. Of course, since the days of Hive and Hadoop, a lot of things have changed. Spark has come and replaced Hadoop itself, and we've got blob stores replacing HDFS. We've got better SQL engines like Presto, Trino, etc. But one thing which has remained from the Hive days is the Hive table format and the meta store. And that the reason for that is these are good table abstractions on top of your blob store or HDFS. So and a lot of products and solutions end up using this abstraction. If you want to do SQL queries on a data lake, then essentially relying on Hive's meta store for storing schemas and locations of data is what they ended up doing. It acted as a Hive table format acted as a unifying layer, basically, which brings multiple engines which allows multiple engines to operate on the S3 compatible data lakes. But there are lots of underlying issues with the Hive table format. One of them being performance, because of the way Hive table format itself works. We'll touch upon that in a bit. Another issue is ACID transactions. You just don't get it, right? Like, so if you are updating 2 partitions, for example, there's no way to say either everything works or nothing works. You are quite often likely to end up with inconsistent state if there's a failure. And also there's no easy way to just update data, right? Like it's, and that's because of the immutable nature of the underlying files. You update an entire partition or not. And nowadays we have a lot of streaming, right? Like there's data flowing in and you need to update your lake. So how do you do it in an efficient fashion? Like all of these are challenges with the Hive table format. And that's where Apache Iceberg comes in. Apache Iceberg is an open table format for analytical data sets. It was originally developed at Netflix to solve some of the issues they were facing with Hive. It was open sourced in 2018, and it's sort of gaining increasing prominence nowadays. The way Iceberg avoids some of Hive's performance issues is Hive works at a directory level. It says this partition is this directory. But instead, Iceberg avoids that and it tracks all the files underlying the directory itself. And this gives it some advantages, which allows it to avoid some of the issues. One of the things this allows it to do is it can actually guarantee isolated reads and writes. So readers will see a consistent view of the data while writers are able to write. Like these are traditional database properties, historically never available in data lakes, right? Like those data lakes are intended to be batch writes and reads, and often the two don't go concurrently and stuff like that. But with modern requirements, that's no longer enough. So Iceberg allows you to do isolated reads and writes and concurrent writes as well. Also, its use of the way it does things underlying the implementation is it uses immutable files and uses metadata to just swap in old files to new files and that sort of thing. The way it does it, it preserves all the old data. So which means you can actually use you can go back in time and say, tell me the answer to this question as of a certain point in time, that sort of use cases. Now, if you've been tracking radars, tech radars blips, a couple of years ago, we blipped about Delta Lake, which is an offering from Databricks. And these are all similar to what Delta Lake offers. And it is exactly similar in the sort of feature set. But comparing it with Delta Lake, one thing is Delta Lake is very Spark centric, whereas Iceberg is, it's a little bit more open. There are multiple systems which now operate on Iceberg, like Dremio, Spark, Presto, so on and so forth. I think it looks like Iceberg is well positioned to become the next Hive, right? Like, which means it will be a key part of multiple products and solutions, and therefore key part of the data ecosystem. That's Apache Iceberg.
Thanks, Sudarshan. As a data mogul, it sounds really powerful and interesting for me. Cool. I saw a question that Shangqi is already answered, but I think it's worth addressing here as well. So Danish is asking, does Salsa and Cyclone DX integrate with development pipelines? So Shangqi already answered that we have some command line tools that has already been linked into the blip description in the upcoming radar. So when you read the radar, there will be some recommended tools in there. And I believe we also have a related tooling around it in the upcoming radar as well. So you will find it in the radar. Cool. Okay, so the next one is text containers from Shangqi.
Yeah, text containers is you could see from the name. It is a tool. It is actually a library helps to creating and managing our containerized dependency and environment for our test. And it is not new in Radar. Actually, we blipped this for access ring 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And at that time, people think it's very hard to create and maintain the reliable, repeatable environment at a local machine, especially for us. Most of our developers developing their application on their Mac desktop, and back to that time, the container orchestration for desktop is not that mature enough. But our challenge is that we need to deal with this new style of application architecture to using multiple containers. So it's very hard for us to run tests to make test this automation test feedback run very fast at locally. So at that time we figure out this two test container, which is a very lovely Java library that help to mitigate this challenge, and it actually helped to spin up the repeatable database instance and similar infrastructure, and help us to run the test. And also it could help to simulate environment that we can run the web-based UI testing locally. And the reason why we moved to adopt this this issue, and apparently we have more experience around it, and people like it. And actually internally we have such arguments around this. So people may think that to have given that Kubernetes is more mature for nowadays, and we can unify the environment, whether it's in your local desktop or it's in your remote cloud, to running in the production or in your build pipeline. So I think that is definitely a valid argument. But the reality is we still, for a lot of teams, they feel challenged to set up their own local Kubernetes clusters to run this simulated environment. So we feel like test container is very nice, very niche to fit into this area. it may not cover every scenario. It may not cover your, your build environment. It can definitely, we do not recommend to run it on your CI/CD pipeline. So we do suggest to maintain your build environment, your CI/CD environment as close as to the production environment. But for the trade-off, if we want to gain a easier setup, a faster feedback for your local development machine, I would say test container is quite helpful. And nowadays, test container could support multiple language and is much more mature nowadays. So on radar, we just move this in, and we hope more people could consider this blip as a choice when you face the trade-off and challenge between your local development environment and your remote production environment.
Thanks, Shangqi. Let's give people a little bit of time to digest test containers. And there is a question about Apache Iceberg to Sudarshan. Is it being supported by the cloud service providers like AWS?
Yes, I think EMR for sure, I know supports it. There might be, I mean, because it's supported by Spark, right? So it's fairly easy for cloud vendors to support it. You don't need to do anything special. You just need to leverage the fact that Spark itself supports it. But if you're asking like Databricks, do they have a formal offering around it? I don't think there's a offering per se there. And I think another question is, how do you compare Apache Iceberg with Delta Lake? I think both are probably equivalent. I don't know if I have concrete comparison stats in terms of feature set. I think they are similar. What I would say is it's more likely that Apache Iceberg is going to become a more prominently available thing in the industry simply because it's a more open format, right? Like Delta Lake as it stands is very Databricks driven and it's very Spark specific. Whereas Hive, if you look at it, was never related to just Hadoop or Spark. Like literally a lot of tools like Apache, Presto, like a lot of them basically ended up building integration by default to Hive. So it's more like that.
Thanks, Sudarshan. And I see there are a few questions about the nature of the text containers. Is it a subset of Docker containers, and is it for dev and sandpig type of work? And is it the similar with dev containers from MSFT VS Code? Shangqi, would you like to take those answers?
Sorry, I'm typing to reply the answer in the Q&A. I just totally missed your question. So can you repeat that?
Yeah, I'm asking that there are a few similar questions asking about the nature of the test containers. Is it a subset of the Docker containers? And is it for dev and sandpig type of work? And how does it, is it similar with dev containers from MSFT? Yeah.
From runtime side, it is not a subset of Docker container, but it is just a Java library, but it do help to help the work for that work, for especially as a alternative environment for those lightweight or one-time running. For example, you want to run the test, you need to provision your environment and run all the tests and then shut it down. So in this case, the test container is a better choice.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, some of the projects I've been in, one way to do it is if you're writing integration tests, right? Like you can, as part of your script, you can start up the dependence services or databases and stuff, and then run your tests. But then the orchestration's happening outside the test. It's happening in your scripts and stuff. What test containers allow you to do is you can, within the test itself, you can just say, I want a container of MongoDB or Postgres or something like that. And that Java library basically uses the Docker protocol to launch the container and manage it. So it's a lot simpler and easier than you doing all the heavy lifting in scripts. And I don't remember the exact data, but I also remember in one of my previous projects, like typically back in the day, we used to use embedded databases, right? Like so that our tests run faster. Typically, a lot of databases have an embedded variant. I think was it Postgres. I don't remember which, but we found that just moving to test containers instead of using the embedded variant just improved the reliability of the tests a lot. And they even went faster, which was a bit interesting, I thought. So yeah, I think that's probably, I would say, the sweet spot, using it as part of your integration tests and stuff like that, apart from the other things that Shangqi mentioned.
Yeah, I think Sudarshan, just with a better metaphor for this, it's more like the in-memory DB we're using for the test. The test container is for such a same use scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you both. So I'm just conscious of time. Let's move on to the next blip. SpiceDB from Sudarshan.
Yeah, so SpiceDB. So SpiceDB is Google Zanzibar-inspired open source database system for managing application permissions. Zanzibar is Google's permission system, its authorization system, and they came out with a paper describing how it works back in 2019. I think SpiceDB is essentially an open source implementation of essentially that paper. Now, typically when we build authorization systems, right, like we typically will build a service either by using an open source or vendor tool where we can define your policies. Now, a consuming application can then talk to the service to authorize the request. A typical implementation would be that the authorization service itself is stateless. So when a client makes a request to authorize, along with the request, you have to send all the data because the service itself just contains the policies. Now, there are certain problems with this approach. Like a lot of use cases, I think this is fine. But take Google's own use case, right? Like if you're sending a mail and you're attaching a document in the mail and you're sending it to some participants, Gmail will actually tell you, hey, you know, some of the participants don't have access to the document. Now, if you have those sort of use cases where the app or the service which is being authorized doesn't necessarily have all the data. In this case, Gmail may not have all the document related data, right? So if you have those sort of use cases where the service itself doesn't own all the data and you still need authorization related to all data, not just what you own, but what other services own, then something like SpiceDB makes sense. What the SpiceDB approach is to not just keep the policies inside, but also keep all the data inside as well. So all the consuming applications have to keep SpiceDB updated anytime their internal data changes. Now, of course, this is a lot more complex and it's effort, but if you have cross-service sort of authorization requirements like this, then this is exactly one of the use cases, basically, or this is a good use of that. And one of the other things that SpiceDB does is, if you have these sort of use cases, you're probably using it across the enterprise, right? And you're probably going to expect a lot of load on the system, in which case you probably need a distributed system. It won't work. It won't be a good idea to just have a single service talking to a RDBMS sort of setup. So SpiceDB implements a consensus protocol and allows it to be scaled out. It has multiple backends, like it offers Cloud Spanner as a backend or CockroachDB as a backend, so that it's a little bit more scalable. How does it actually work? It essentially converts all the data and policies you define in its internal DSL into a graph, and it translates all authorization requests into a graph traversal problem. So when you ask the question, can this user access resource Y, or what resources this user has access to, it just traverses its internal graph to determine all of that information. So I felt it was an interesting implementation of an authorization service and something to just think about in case you have such a need.
Thank you, Sudarshan. Sounds really interesting. And I think the next blip is around in the front end area. Shangqi is going to talk about the remix.
Yeah, we finally have a front end framework this time, and actually we all know that the front end development develops so fast, and I remember back to over 1 decade ago, most people talk about the web development. We are actually talking about using the back-end framework to generate page, static page, or dynamic page for the website. And since the rise of single page application, we see more frameworks like React, Angular, Ember.js to encourage people to think more from a web point of view, to treat the browser itself as an application to write your UI in your animation, your render logic in your browser side. So I do think we have seen this trend to moving from the pure server-side rendering website to the single page applications that most of the rendering happen in the browser. But nowadays it seems like we see more frameworks just came back to server-side rendering. So for example, the Next.js is quite a good example. It combines the server-side rendering, the static page with its dynamic generated. It is a React-based framework that can allow you to write application in the front end. So combine them together to have better experience, and it's called full stack. People may not know full stack. What full stack means? Basically, you can use this framework to write both front end and back end. So we have seen this trend in the front end development or web development area, and Remix is another example. Remix.js is a quite fresh full stack JavaScript framework. It can write both front end and back end. It can render the view and can optimize the route, the loading in the front end, and also it can integrate with your while mapping your database in the backend. So basically, it's a full stack framework. And the reason why we propose it this time is it provides a quite fast page loading by leveraging the distributed system and the native browser instead of just to render some dummy static page in the server side. So we do see it made some optimization and for example, for the nested routing and page loading to streamline the speed of page. And it's quite fascinating. And our people still evaluating its rendering speed to compare with other alternatives like Next.js. But I would say, although Remix and Next.js, they may have similar position, but they do have differentiated features. And we are more glad to see people think more about how to remix front-end development and with back-end development, how to better utilize the browser runtime as well as the back-end server-side runtime to give the customer a better experience for the page view.
Thank you, Shangqi. Cool. All right. Now let's come on to our last but not least theme from this reader, Sudarshan.
Thanks, Ni. I think Ni earlier talked about themes, right? Like this is our second theme of the day, changing economics of open source. I think this generated a lot of internal debates, not the theme itself, but various blips related to it. And that's why this became a theme. We felt there's definitely something here. If you look at the changing nature of open source software, right? Like I think even there was a study which said that compared to 3 years ago or 3-4 years ago to today, the number of open source components which underpin any of our applications is significantly higher. It might have increased like 4x, 5x sort of thing. There was some research that an average commercial application nowadays has 528 open source components as part of it. And I'm sure you guys have all seen the XKCD jokes where there's a complex structure, but dependent on one small open source component maintained by one person somewhere sort of thing, right? Like that's actually a very common joke nowadays. Now, essentially what's happening is there are multiple aspects to this. Like one is, how do you do sustainable open source? There was some research done, I think back in 2019 on a small set of projects which are popular. And what it said was that over 50% of projects couldn't sustain their maintainers above poverty line at all, right? And over 31% of the remaining generated some money, but for a salary, but it was considered unacceptable by the industry. Log4j issue, recently we talked about it, re-triggered this long-standing debate of how to do sustainable open source, because Log4j was maintained by 2 people. And, essentially this is not their primary job. They're not paid. The ability to respond immediately will not be there because this is not their main job. But at the same time, the industry depends on Log4j. A significant part of the industry depends on Log4j. So on one hand, you've got companies like Google, Netflix, and all, they release open source software, which they build internally, fund it, and promote it strongly. And, that's almost like corporate open source sort of thing. But at the other extreme, we have a large number of open source projects, which basically have like 1 or 2 developers who are working in their spare time. And how do you support that ecosystem? There are options like Patreon and stuff like that, where you can help fund it as a consumer if you like them and stuff like that. But often this doesn't help. I remember one of the Thoughtworkers telling in a group that he's a maintainer of an open source project, but when he got some funding, for him it felt more like a burden, because now he had to spend additional time after supporting it, because someone has sort of given him some money to sort of fund it. It creates this additional feeling of responsibility, in fact. That's one aspect of open source, but then there are other aspects, right? Like this is more the commercial model around open source. For example, Elasticsearch modified their license last year to Elastic license and SSPL, following on the footsteps of others like Mongo, Redis, etc. What they were doing was they were defending against AWS, right? Like, because AWS would take their software and create a service around it. There's a fundamental tension between commercial open source model, in which businesses maintain open source products and sell premium versions and associate services, and then the cloud computing market. And of course, as a reaction to this, they are no longer deemed open source, or at least as strictly defined by OSI, right? Like they instead become source open or something like that. So all of these are changing dynamics. What does it mean to us? I think, okay, firstly, of course, as Thoughtworks, we continue to be passionate, and we think we have to find a way to make this better, because we are strong proponents of open source, and we know all the positives related to it. But as large companies leverage, or as companies leveraging open source, we should start to think deeply about what does it mean to support the open source community. I think we have all been happy consuming, but how do you support it? How do you support it in a more effective fashion? And what libraries do you actually use from open source? You have to worry about how well maintained it is. We talked about supply chain issues and stuff. I think basically these start to become important questions. I don't think we have an answer for the problem space. I think this is more us calling out that this is a problem. It is becoming more complex. The dynamics are a little bit more complex, but it is something we have to start thinking and consciously sort of figuring out what our strategy is.
Thank you, Sudarshan. Yeah, it's a very I have been using interesting a lot in this webinar, but it is an interesting topic, and what you just said really touches as a developer. I mean, cool. So yeah, that's all we have prepared for this webinar. If you have more questions, you can feel free to type into the Q&A, and because we have a bit of more time. And I myself actually prepared a question to both of our panelists. So in this webinar, you have covered lots of areas, right? The security, working in the cloud native area, the data, and front end, and lots of stuff. And I also know that in the radar, many times we also talk about team practices, right? Is there anything that you can help us to sneak peek a little in that area as well?
Regarding the, maybe I go first, and regarding the team collaboration, I would say nowadays we're definitely huge impacted by the pandemic, and everyone enters the remote work mode, and there are emerging practices that we see in the team that works in the remote context. For example, in this radar, we have a blip called the single remote virtual wall. Actually, it's quite easy to have this visualize the physical wall when we are together, say in the same office, and it helps us to unify our understanding of common view. We may put some storyboard, we may put some like architecture diagram on that, but it's very hard for us to keep that in track when we're in a remote mode. We have siloed software, siloed information source using this to share our diagram for architecture, use that to share our product backlog, use another to trace our tech debt. Or even we may not able to have chance to emphasize the team practice that we valued given in such a remote nature. So that single team remote wall is quite a good technique to have this. You can use any tool you are in favor to trying to simulate a physical wall experience, but the choosing is trying to from the radiator perspective or from the visualizing perspective to give the team a more collaborative, more unified view to remind team what is our way of working, what is our the standard process or standard practice that we can track, we can trace in everyday life. So I would say that's a quite practical and useful technique, and I recommend people to read on Radar and to know more about it.
Thank you, Shangqi. Maybe for me, my favorite from a people side is something which has been blipped in the past as well. I think it's over a couple of years, 1.5 years old now. It's the team cognitive load. I'm a big fan of this blip because I think it's a great way to measure is this a high performing team or not, and one of the root causes for why not often tends to be the team cognitive load. So using this as a way to define team boundaries and what is, and what is therefore the right architecture to support your team. I'm a big fan of this blip, so definitely look at it.
Thank you both. And sorry that I dragged more content out. Cool. So there is a question in the Q&A asking whether the latest release is 25 or 26. Actually, the current one is 25 and the upcoming one is 26. And what we talked today is 26. And it's actually a perfect way to end this webinar today. So the upcoming webinar is coming soon, probably in a week also. So stay tuned. And if you want to get an email or get notified, you can subscribe through the link I just shared in the chat. And thank you everyone again for listening and joining us today, and have a great day ahead. Thank you. Bye-bye.